Hello, I'm Donald Maurice, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to the NZBBC interviews. That stands for New Zealand Baby Boomer Composers. Over this series, we're interviewing 10 composers from around New Zealand, born between the mid-1940s and the mid-1960s, known as the Baby Boomers. We've got 2 from Auckland, 2 from Hamilton, 2 from Wellington, 2 from Christchurch, and 2 from Dunedin. The series is being hosted by the New Zealand School of Music at Victoria University and SOUNZ Centre for New Zealand Music. It's my pleasure to welcome Anthony Ritchie.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Before I ask Anthony my questions, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about him. Anthony is Professor of Composition at Otago University and combines his interest in composition with a passion for teaching and mentoring young composers. In 2011, he was chosen to arrange the music for the 20 national anthems at the Rugby World Cup. Anthony combines his interest in music with an interest in sport and has represented New Zealand at 2 Croquet World Championships. Anthony's PhD focused on the music of Béla Bartók. He has composed over 180 compositions, actually more, I think, you told me.
Yeah, but over 200
Over
now.
200 now, growing all the time. And his music has been performed in many countries in the UK, Europe, Asia and the USA by groups such as the Takaks Quartet, the Egna Trio and the Yang Quartet. He's had many CDs releases of his music, and the BBC Symphony Orchestra recording on Atoll of his A Bugle Will Do was named one of the CDs of the year on the MusicWeb International site. On a personal note, I was honoured to give the world premiere of Anthony's first viola concerto with the Southern Sinfonia back in 1995. So now to my first question for Anthony. I'd like to know about your childhood, where you were born, what your family environment was like for learning music. Did you have brothers and sisters, parents, grandparents? What was the environment like when you were very young?
Well, I did come from a musical family, and I can go back to my grandparents. My grandmother was a good pianist, and my grandfather, who I never met, he was a singer in a group called Diggers during the First World War, and passed on that music to my mother, who also became a good singer, a soprano. She sang in Messiahs and the like. So I had music on my mother's side, but also my father's side. My father became a composer and a professor of music. So everyone says, well, you're following in your father's footsteps, which I guess I am, but it wasn't a conscious decision. But he actually came from a very disadvantaged background and was pretty well orphaned by the age of 12, but had the good fortune to be sent to a school in Dunedin called King Edward Technical, where he was taught music by Vernon Griffiths, who was a composer and fine musician, and that's where his musical career, if you like, started. And
And what about instruments? When did you start to learn instruments?
When I was about 7 or 8, I started learning the piano, and I had some good piano teachers, Bill Hawkey, Rosemary Stott, and I loved the piano, and the piano was really my way into composing because I tended to like improvising rather than learning the pieces I was supposed to learn, much to my teacher's dismay. But so I learnt the piano. I learnt the cello a little bit, but found that too hard, gave that up. I got my sort of ensemble experience from learning singing later in life. So I joined the National Youth Choir when I was about 19.
So you were born in Christchurch.
Yeah.
What was primary school like for music in those days?
It was fairly basic. My parents were Roman Catholics, and so they sent me to Catholic schools. So we had nuns, and some of them were good teachers. There was one in particular who I owe a lot to, and they loved music. So yes, it was encouraging. You know, we sang a lot and enjoyed music.
So you lived through the days when the Christchurch School of Instrumental Music was pretty huge.
Yeah.
Did you have much encounter with that in those young years?
No, I didn't, and that's something I've regretted during my life. For one reason or other, I wasn't sent along or given the opportunity as a cello player to go along there. So I felt that quite keenly in my teenage years, actually, because was quite a lonely teenager, and so when the opportunity came to join a choir, that was wonderful to be making music with other people.
Mm-hmm. So when you progressed on to high school, where did you go, and what was that like for music?
Well, I went to St Bede's College in Christchurch, which is a Catholic boarding school, and that was double-edged.
Mm-hmm.
We had a good music teacher there, Margaret Buchanan, who's the sister of Dorothy Buchanan, and in fact Dorothy was also floating around Christchurch still then, and I would go after school to her after-school composition sessions down at Papanui High, and that was very encouraging. But the school itself was a typical boys' school of that era, and if you were caught carrying your cello across the quad, you might be called various names, like Pufta or whatever.
Yeah.
So it was as I say, it was double. There was two sides to it.
And was there a time during your secondary, or maybe even younger, when you decided you wanted to be a composer? When did that happen? When did the penny drop?
Well, I guess I'm a little bit unusual in that my father was a composer, and he was quite well known by the time I came along. So there was even LPs of his music at home, which we played. So the idea of being a composer didn't seem strange to me. It seemed like a normal state of affairs. So even at the age of 10 and 11, I can remember making up pieces by ear at the piano and playing them and thinking, oh, this is good fun, I'm going to do more of this. I don't think I sort of consciously thought of it being a career until quite a bit later, really.
So you got to the end of high school and it was time to go to university. Was it a natural thing to go to Canterbury, or did you think you might go somewhere else because your dad was there?
No, I thought it was quite natural just to go to Canterbury. Maybe it was my lack of adventurousness, but I was quite happy to go there. It was probably a bit awkward for him because he was still teaching there at that stage. So I believe, well, I've learned since that he got other people to assess work that he might have been involved with.
Right. But he was your teacher at some point in the classes, in composition? Yeah.
Yes, we had some lectures with him and conducting. Not for composition though, actually. We tended to learn from other composers there.
So did you work with John Cousins and in composition? Yeah,
John Cousins, Chloe Moon, who doesn't really compose much these days, but she was a fine composer and a fine teacher. So Chloe and John, two very different types of composers, and John, of course, is well known as a sort of very avant-garde composer, electroacoustic. I enjoyed all those different sort of approaches and thinking about music. Made me think a lot about what music is.
And Bill Hawkey, he must have had some influence too, and at least on the technical side of things, so counterpoint, harmony, all that sort of thing.
Well, actually, he wasn't at university when I got there. He taught me piano, but no, we had Heath Lees and John Jennings and other people.
Yeah. So later on, did you continue straight on to do PhD, or did that come later in life?
No, I went straight on to do a PhD.
And you got interested in the music of Béla Bartók. What was behind that?
Well, I'd always liked Bartók's music from age 13, 14, I suppose. And in fact, I played quite a bit on the piano. And so I was very drawn to East European music, Russian music, Stravinsky, Shostakovich, Bartók. So it seemed like a natural thing to do in a way. I have to say, part of the reason for doing the PhD was so I could get scholarships, go overseas and study composition as well as doing the PhD. So it was, and Budapest, Hungary, where I went, was a cheaper option too. It was in the communist days, so the exchange rate was very favourable.
So you can sit a little bit out studying composition overseas. Who did you encounter? What did you focus on?
I initially was put together with a teacher called Attila Bozai, who is not that well known, but he was quite a big figure in Hungarian composition scene back then, alongside Kurtag and those guys. And he and a couple of other teachers I had sort of showed me some different approaches, sort of shook me away and said, you can't compose like Poulenc or whatever, you've got to you've got to try these other things. And there was quite an experimental scene then by this stage in Hungary. So I tried all sorts of things, serialism and aleatoric music, and and I won a prize with one of the pieces that I did over there, which was nice. But when I came back, I realised that this wasn't actually the music that I really wanted to write. I got more satisfaction out of other approaches.
So is that study there part of the PhD or separate from it?
It was separate from it, yeah.
So to what degree do you think that Eastern European folk music has found its way into your compositions, or at least back then and since?
Yeah, I think it stayed with me, even though I've made quite a concerted effort to shake Bartók off as an influence in the late 80s. I think the love of pentatonic scales and modal qualities in music has stayed with me, so even to current music. And also a liking for duality in music, a liking for polymodality, so using two modes at the same time, and creating contrasts, I guess, in the music in harmonic sort of ways.
So thinking back over your life, have there been particular genres of music that you've become interested in, whether to influence you or you just enjoyed listening to? And I'm thinking even outside Western art music, rock music, pop music. What's been your sort of trajectory across life and what you've been interested in?
Well, I started out with a very eclectic mindset, and I think I've maintained that to quite a large degree. Yes, I did like some popular music, and in the 90s, when I was trying to shake off Bartók, late 80s, 90s, I got interested in minimalist music, and also popular styles of music surrounding that. And as a way of, as I say, shaking off the sort of more what I saw as an overly intellectual approach to music that has sort of hamstrung a lot of contemporary music. And so it was also brought out of personal experience too. Music therapy sessions I remember having as a result of personal crisis, and realising that what an impact music can have on us psychologically in all sorts of ways. And I really wanted my music to be able to do those sorts of things, to be able to make deeply felt statements. So as a result of that, I was trying to look for a language that would reflect that. And in rock music, I saw that. I used to go to rock concerts and see the cathartic experience that would have on people. So that was one degree of influence. I also been interested in other Eastern types of music, gamelan, and that's nothing new, but that was a powerful influence for me in the 90s and ever since.
Any other non-Western influences? Indian music or? Not particularly, not Indian. Music of the tangata whenua, Maori music has influenced me from quite early on, actually, from the early 80s onwards. But I would say that I've come to that more over a long period of time. Was that a conscious decision to kind of get a New Zealand identity into your music, or it just happened? Or, what is your feeling about national identity and music in general?
Getting on to the curly questions.
Yeah.
I think to start with, it was actually wide-eyed astonishment at what Maori music was and what it had to offer, because it's hard to explain to the younger generation now, but when I was brought up, we didn't know anything really about Maori culture. It was very Pākehā upbringing, and so the discovery of these things was really exciting for me. And so, however, I'm very conscious of the idea of the dangers of misappropriating someone else's culture. So I've always had the philosophy that there has to be a genuine, heartfelt love for the source that you're using or referencing, if you are going to do that, and that you have to have experienced it in numerous ways. And So, for example, for me, the sound of the karanga, as you greeted onto the marae, is a very powerful emotional statement, calling the spirits of the past and so forth. And I found that gesture coming into my music at various stages, and it's at an unconscious, almost unconscious level these days. So I think ideally, if that's what ideally we should strive for, is not a sort of a conscious borrowing in the Stravinsky-like sense, but a thorough engagement with a culture and an absorbing of those things.
So this engagement's involved the music, but what about the tango puro? Have you used instruments in your compositions?
A little, yes, yes, I have. I had a very nice collaboration with Alexa Still, actually, who, when she was in New Zealand, she learnt the instruments with Richard Nuns and was and very encouraging to me. Said, write me a piece with these instruments. And I thought I was very hesitant to start with, but I enjoyed my engagement with those instruments, and now we have Samba Tago, and I help my students to get interested in them. And so I love that sound world, and I think your question about national identity, I think that is an area that is I think an area of growing New Zealand identity, the sort of if you like coming together of cultures. What it broadly say, Pākehā and Māori cultures. And if I was, I'd love to be living 100 years' time or 200 years' time. I think looking back, we would see that at the moment, what we're going through at the moment is just the beginning or the starting of something that's really going to become quite big. That's my feeling. And that, harking back to the 20th century, usually when we talk about national identity, we start with Lilburn. I think the perception of that may change over time. That will be seen as a more post-colonial sort of period in our history. Still very much a Pākehā.
So when you were going through your kind of formative years and training as a composer, did you feel that Lilburn legacy that we have to establish a national identity, did that feel like a duty?
A duty. Well, there were two things. One is, just at a personal level, I wasn't that particularly drawn to Lilburn's music initially, just at a purely sensual level. I didn't actually like it that much, which is a terrible thing to say, but that's the truth. Over time, I grew to like and love some of his music, and but I felt that a stronger affinity with the New Zealand tradition through our writers, so the writers of the 30s and 40s, Janet Frame, Curnow and Glover and all these people from the past, and our painters as well. And yes, I was very keen to create music that somehow reflected a New Zealand quality about our speech, because after all we have our own accent. We are New Zealanders, we speak in a way that no one else does, so there must be something that's different about us to everywhere else.
So you mentioned minimalism before, and I know you've written articles about this and it's been an important topic for you. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've written about in terms of minimalism and how it connects to New Zealand composition? Right,
yes. Well, yes, I wrote this article in the Searches for Tradition book about New Zealand influence of minimalism on New Zealand music. I thought it was an interesting angle because it seemed to be, from my perspective, that minimalism was a bit of a dirty word in the 80s and 90s in New Zealand. People used to mock it for being boring and commercial, sellout, etc., etc., etc. And yet, to me, it seemed to me that it had an influence or an effect on some quite significant composers. David Hamilton was, I guess, one of the early ones to pick it up, but also John Pasafis and Gareth Farr and Jack Boddy. And these are all major composers in New Zealand. And I think a lot of the reason for the appeal of their music is this liking for a somewhat simpler approach, reducing down to more essentials, the use of pulse, repetition, gradual change. These things that make contemporary music maybe slightly more user-friendly than some of the other types of music. So I found that interesting. Partly myself, I was influenced by the minimalist trend in the late 80s, but I've never really, as a composer, I wouldn't describe myself as a minimalist composer at all. But nonetheless, I see that influence being important on New Zealand music, and I think in the long run it may be important as part of our identity too.
Have you ever been drawn to electronic music composition for your own self, or incorporated it in any way?
Not really, no. I did create one electronic piece under John Cousin's supervision as a student, which is probably gathering dust somewhere on a reel-to-reel tape. But it's funny that you asked that, because I often thought it would be fun to go back to that, but I think I'm far too long in the tooth now, and not that good with technology, so I leave that to better people.
So other interesting compositional techniques that perhaps you've tried and they're not continued, serialism, for instance, avant-garde techniques. What have you tried out and thought, no, that's not for me?
Yes, well, as I said, in the early days I did try serialism, aleatoric methods, and in fact I came back to that a little bit around about year 2000. I got a bit, shall we say, I got a bit tired of the style I'd developed, the simpler style, and I felt the need to try some different approaches. It's a bit of a creative rut, and this is something that happens to composers occasionally. They get to a stage where they feel they need to try new things. So I tried used serialism a little bit at that point, but also magic squares. So I adopted a technique that Maxwell Davies, through Gillian Whitehead, had used, and I found that interesting as a way of generating ideas. I never stuck to systems terribly rigidly. I'm not a systematic sort of guy, so I tended to use them in an intuitive way. But nonetheless, it had an effect on the type of music that I used. So in a piece called Whale Song, for example, which I wrote, a sort of environmental protest piece, it's all based on magic squares and the golden section, and some quite special effects on the instruments too. And I was quite happy with the piece. Yeah.
So I've listened to quite a lot of your music over the years, and I find that of the New Zealand composers, you're one of the easiest ones to say, that's a piece by Anthony Ritchie. There's something in there that you leave your signature. Difficult to define. Are you able to identify yourself, the kind of things that might, make your music have its own distinctive sound?
Yes, it's a difficult one, that. It is hard speaking, objectively about your own work in that sort of way. I would say it's a combination of things, I think. As I mentioned, use of pentatonic scale modes, polymodality. Also, I've got a liking for symmetrical progressions. So for me, that's an important thing. And I I have a tendency towards relatively clear musical structures and textures. I can write more complex music if I want, but I think by comparison to some, it's simpler. And maybe that plus a combination of sort of elements from Eastern European music and Maori elements, at various stages. So here, as you can tell, I'm sort of scrambling around here trying to pin down a few essential things, but it's, in the end, it's almost an intangible thing, but I think it's a very important.
It's essentially always tonal?
Usually, yes. I don't sort of consciously say, I'm going to write the piece in this key, because I don't use key signatures, but it always seems to end up being tonal in some sense.
Tonal centre, at least, yeah. Could you maybe think about pieces that you've written that have really stood out in your mind as, wow, that was a major really important piece to me? I mean, I know you have many and you want to choose them all, but if you wanted to single out, 2 or 3, for instance, that, wow, that was a great moment, what would you focus on? What would you think about?
Well, you said it's hard too. I've still got a fond spot for some couple of early works of mine, the Hanging Bulb, which dates from 1989, when I was just really starting that move away from Bartók. And that was the first piece of mine that was recorded by the NZSO, and it took off and was used in school, so I've got some good associations with it, and I'm still fond of it, yeah. And my first symphony, I guess, from the 90s was an important piece for me. But more latterly, I guess the Fourth Symphony that I wrote about 5 years ago, which commemorates the Christchurch earthquakes, was an important piece for me, in that it's sort of at the tail end of that period of experimentation, and so it's using quite a diverse range of elements, but still hopefully makes a reasonably powerful statement about that event.
So should we have a listen to something? What would you like us to listen to?
Oh, well, since we've mentioned the Fourth Symphony, we could maybe have a listen to a little bit out of that, which is it's subtitled Stations, as in Stations of the Cross, which is a Catholic ceremony. I'm no longer a Catholic, but I'm referencing a mythology from my past, and the reason for that is that the piece focuses on the Christchurch Basilica, which, as you probably realise, was destroyed in the earthquake and now won't be rebuilt. And in that basilica are 14 stations designed by Lou Summers, very beautiful, which will never be retrieved now, I don't think. And so I wrote a piece, an item about each of those stations. So the point being that the suffering of Christ the suffering of Christchurch is reflected in the suffering of Christ. Well, it's a metaphor. And so in this particular bit we're going to hear, I think you'll hear a little bit of a gamelan influence in the music.
Let's have a listen. Okay, beautiful, very moving. Yeah.
Thank you. I should mention, just as we were stopped, I start to quote a piece out of Palestrina. This is you're talking about asking about new techniques, and I've got interested in recomposition in the last few years, adopting other people's music and recomposing them for particular meaning as well.
So, something else that you'd like us to listen to?
Right.
Tell us about a chamber work, perhaps.
Chamber work, okay. Yes, we've got a piece that I wrote recently for the New Zealand Trio called Childhood, and it's a short piece. This, I think, represents a sort of a new angle that I'm taking in the last 4 or 5 years, at which I'm struggling to just come up with a description for it, but it's, for want of a better word, a naive style of writing, where I'm trying to see the world through a child's eyes, through a child's lens, whilst still maintaining an adult perspective in the background, if you like. And I've been interested in the work of the naive artists, which Rousseau and co. from the late 19th century to early 20th century, and how effective that view is. It's also because I guess I've had children myself, how differently they could see things and how original their thoughts are and how creative. And so I'm quite interested in the idea of using really elemental things in the music. So the piece that we're going to hear, it starts out almost like a little child's chant, basically. It's really, really simple and gradually builds up. But there can be different layers in it as well.
And reflecting on your own memories of childhood, no doubt, as well.
Yes, yes, that's right.
Yeah. Let's have a listen. Definitely got the Anthony Ritchie language happening there.
Is it?
Yeah,
Oh,
where I would recognise that as your piece. Yeah, I can't. Maybe it's the kind of pentatonic-y kind of scales. The rhythm, da-dum, da-dum, da-dum.
Yeah,
Maybe it's a gamelani influence there as well.
yeah, they do.
Yeah. Why are there extra bows on the seat?
Extra bows?
Well, they had extra bows in the picture.
Did
they change bows during the...
Must do.
Yeah. Okay, maybe time just for one more?
Sure, yes, a piece, this is a song from a work of mine called Gallipoli to the Somme, which was, I was asked to write a work commemorating World War I in 2016 with the local orchestra in Dunedin and choir, and it was a mission really to do justice to that, but I guess part of the simplifying of my style in the last few years came about through this experience of writing this piece, in that initially I felt it was a commemorative work for an occasion, and sometimes you tend to, you can write differently for that circumstance. But after a while I realised that I was actually writing the sort of music I wanted to write regardless, and I felt that this was an important thing, that there isn't actually a difference between the two things. And so the song we're going to hear, Alan's Vigil, which features Annalise singing, is a representation of trauma, a mother who's lost 3 sons in the war, and every day she goes out and digs her garden, digs, looking for her 3 sons. And so I've tried to capture that in the music with a very simple 3-note motif, 1 note for each of the sons. Yeah.
Have a listen. Well, thank you. Three very contrasting works.
Yeah, okay.
Very beautiful. I think this is the moment where we're going to take questions from the floor.
Sure.
So please. Patrick.
Hello. I was really interested in your PhD on Béla Bartók. I was wondering, what did you discover in your PhD? Just generally. Also, you kept saying something about, you just kept talking about shaking off Béla Bartók. What encouraged you to do that?
PhD is quite a long time ago now. It's 30 years ago, but so I have to struggle to remember. What I did find is the depth to which he incorporated folk elements into his music. It's not just the matter of arranging some nice tunes. It's in every harmony, every pitch combination of his work. It's a thorough absorption, if you like, of the elements into a whole musical language. So that was very important. I also discovered, I got quite interested in the sound world that he was exposed to through folk music and his observation of improvisation and performative elements in folk music, and realising how intuitive a composer he was. He wasn't, my initial impressions of Bartók has always been that he's a very systematic composer, following all these abstract concepts, but I think that's been overemphasised. I think it's actually he's a lot more intuitive than we might understand from some of the literature. So, and when it came to shaking off the influence, his music is so distinctive, his style is so distinctive that if you adopt too many of his methods, you just end up sounding like Bartók. So that's why I wanted to. I guess I was conscious of shaking off the more dense counterpoint, the more complex textures that he tended to go for in his music.
Alan.
Does your approach differ if you're working for a commission with a particular kaupapa, a public collaboration, private event, as opposed to a more open-ended one?
I'm finding less and less these days that's the case. As I said before, I used to feel a duality. In the 90s when I was a freelancer, I felt these were my pieces for the occasions and these were my ones that I really wanted to write. But as I've got older in more recent times, I feel that ideally they should be one and the same. I know you do make some allowances depending, for example, if you're writing for a children's song or whatever, you're not necessarily going to write in quite the same way, but more or less, the piece we just heard now is what I like writing, and at the end of the day, my acid test is to, do you want to sit down and listen to your own music and enjoy it, and for me that's quite important test, yeah. Okay.
You mentioned the mocking of minimalism in a critical way.
Yeah.
Didn't you indulge in some mocking of minimalism yourself if you wrote a quartet?
Oh, he's got a good memory. I did rather, but that. Yes, that's true. That was in the one scene, wasn't it? There was a character in the opera quartet who is a frustrated composer. He's a cellist, but what he really wants to do is be a composer. And in one of the scenes, he insists that the quartet play one of his pieces, and it's the most boring piece of repetitive minimalist music you could imagine. But that was just for a particular purpose. No, I wasn't actually meaning to make a statement about minimalism. Though, of course, you can get good and bad music in any style, and it's the same with minimalism. You can get some pretty boring pieces of minimalism. Yeah. Yeah.
You mentioned the other intellectualism of music, particularly in the 80s and 90s, I think.
Yeah.
Do you think there's been a change in that approach, or do you think that there are different types of composition now? How do you see it?
I think the latter. I think there's a very wide range of types of music being composed now. In a sort of a postmodern age, you can take any route you like, really. So there's still plenty of music that's very abstract and intellectually conceived, and I've got nothing against that. I think that's absolutely fine. But for me personally, I like a particular approach that's maybe a little bit less that way inclined. And I think one of the things about minimalism was that it brought the process of music to the foreground, so you can actually hear what's happening in the music, and it's got a reason for being there, rather than it just being in the background as a nice sort of thing in the background. But that's just a personal opinion, and I think, as I said, it's a very, as John Cage said, it's like a river delta. It's getting wider and wider as we go, and more globalised too. So it's lots of different approaches possible.
Any more? In that case, I think we'll wrap it up, and thank you very much for joining us on the series.
Thank you.